What would you do if you uncovered the biggest secret of your life? Clara Hastings had a simple answer: face the truth, no matter what the cost. But when she discovers that truth, something even more terrifying emerges. She must fight to save her life, and those closest to her. The hidden, haunting truth of this story shakes the very foundation of not just one person, but the power structures of an entire world. The courtroom was thick with an oppressive silence, the kind that seemed to smother any sound, every whisper muted by the weight of the moment. The light from the weak winter sun struggled to penetrate the high leaded windows, casting pale beams across the dark oak panels that lined the room, their creaks and groans echoing in the stillness. The heavy clock on the wall ticked methodically, its rhythmic sound slicing through the air, marking each passing second as if it too understood the gravity of what was unfolding. The rows of spectators sat in strained stillness, shifting uneasily on the hard benches, their restless movements stark against the almost tangible quiet that gripped the room. Beneath the vaulted ceiling, the atmosphere felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for some inevitable conclusion. At the heart of it all, Clara Hastings stood alone, her small frame tense with defiance. Barely 24, her youthful face was pale, but her eyes, sharp and resolute, glinted with a quiet strength that betrayed none of the fear or uncertainty that one might expect from a woman in her position. She stood draped in a simple gray shawl, its fabric tugged tightly around her shoulders, her knuckles white from the tension in her grip. The eyes of the room followed her every move, but Clara didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed, unwavering, on the judge as he sat high above her, behind his imposing bench. His figure loomed over her, his robes dark against the polished wood of the courtroom, his presence commanding but somehow cold. Guilty. The word fell from his lips like a stone dropped into still water, its impact reverberating throughout the room, carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the very air they breathed. His voice was firm, deliberate, but there was a faint tremor that betrayed the tension behind his words. Gasps rippled through the gallery, some in disbelief, others in resignation, but Clara did not flinch. She didn't look at the spectators or the pressmen scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Her green eyes, bright and clear, were locked on the judge, her face an expressionless mask that betrayed nothing of the emotion swirling beneath. When he continued, rejecting her plea with a simple "the sentence will stand," she didn't move for a long moment. Then quietly, she spoke, her voice cold but even. "Thank you, Your Honor." It was not gratitude. It was acknowledgement, a final recognition of a system she had no power to change. The words left a bitter echo in the room, hanging in the air long after she was led away. The sound of her shoes scraping against the stone floor was stark in the otherwise hushed room, a sharp, jagged reminder of the finality of the moment. As she was escorted out, the gallery shifted, a collective exhalation of disbelief, murmurs rising in the wake of what had just transpired. There was something unsettling in the air, a sense that the story was far from over. Agatha Marple, seated quietly at the back of the room, took in the scene with a calm that only years of experience could provide. The elderly detective, her small frame blending in with the crowd, was unnoticed by the majority. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her expression unreadable, except for the faint narrowing of her eyes as she observed the judge. There was something about him, an unease, a subtle haste in the way he gathered his papers and descended from the bench. His rigid posture, the tightness around his mouth, it spoke of a man accustomed to control, yet there was a crack in that facade, something that didn't sit right. Agatha followed his every move with the intensity of a hawk, and when he passed Clara without so much as a glance, her mind began to turn. There was something more to this, something she wasn't seeing yet. Agatha sat still for a moment, letting the scene settle in her mind like a jigsaw puzzle she wasn't quite able to complete. The murmurs of the gallery faded as the crowd began to disperse, but in the back of her mind, the words "His Honor has been very particular about this case" reverberated, a phrase she had overheard between two clerks. It had been said lightly, almost as if tossed aside in casual conversation, but it carried an undercurrent that Agatha immediately recognized. There was something here, something that needed closer scrutiny. She stood up, smoothing her skirt as she made her way toward the exit. The cold air outside hit her like a wall, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the crowd, noting the two men standing near the courthouse pillars. One was tall and angular, with a sharp, polished demeanor, the other shorter, with a round, ruddy face. They were speaking in hushed tones, and Agatha, ever the observer, caught every word. "There's something strange about it," the taller one said, his voice sharp and filled with the kind of authority that came with years of practice in a courtroom. "His Honor's ruling. It's the first time we've seen something like this." His voice dropped to a whisper, but Agatha was close enough to hear the weight behind his words. The shorter man, his face flushed, shook his head dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous, Hawkins," he muttered. "You know the pressure he's under. Unseen pressures. It's better not to dig into it." Unseen pressures. The phrase caught Agatha's attention, her ears pricking at the words as she moved closer, adjusting her shawl with the pretense of being absorbed in the pigeons pecking near the courthouse steps. She kept her gaze elsewhere, but every instinct screamed that there was something she needed to learn here. She moved just a little closer, enough to hear the words, but not enough to be noticed. The two men, after a few more quick exchanges, turned away and began descending the steps, their voices fading as they walked. Agatha followed them, her thoughts turning over the conversation like a puzzle she was desperate to solve. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Hawkins, the taller of the two, fumbled with his bag, spilling papers onto the ground. One of them, a worn leather ledger, fell open with a muted thud. The cover was cracked, the edges frayed, and it was the kind of thing that held years of history within its pages. Agatha, her movements fluid and graceful, bent down to pick it up. "Excuse me, sir," she called, her tone light, disarming. "It seems you've dropped this." Hawkins, his face tightening with irritation and embarrassment, muttered a quick thank you, as he took the ledger from her. As their hands brushed briefly, Agatha caught a glimpse of the open page, and her sharp eyes immediately recognized something. A name. The name, although not unfamiliar, was one she had never seen in such a context, and it sent a chill down her spine. A thread had been pulled, and now it was up to her to follow it to its end. The courtroom was a cavernous space, its walls steeped in an eerie silence that seemed to stretch time itself. The faint rustling of papers, the barely perceptible shuffle of feet, everything felt exaggerated in the stillness. The air hung heavy, tinged with the faintest scent of old wood and dust, a stark contrast to the cold, unfeeling marble floors beneath. The sunlight, filtering through the tall windows, barely seemed to touch the gloom inside, casting faint, ghostly beams that flickered and disappeared as quickly as they arrived. Each second seemed to drag on, and yet Clara Hastings stood frozen in the heart of it, her face pale, her posture stiff with a mixture of defiance and disbelief. At only 24, she exuded a quiet strength that belied the gravity of her situation, her green eyes fierce with an unspoken determination that made her appear older, wiser, as if she had seen too much for someone so young. Her lips pressed into a hard line, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep herself from trembling. Her hands were clenched at her sides, the only sign of the storm brewing within her. The judge's words echoed in her mind long after they were spoken. Guilty. The word struck her with the force of a hammer, but she didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on him, unwavering, as the sentence was handed down. It wasn't just a decision about her future. It felt like a final verdict on everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. The murmurs of the spectators filled the air around her, but they were distant sounds, as though they came from another world, one where things weren't quite so wrong. Her world had shattered with that one word. The judge's voice continued, but Clara's mind had already retreated into a silent rage, one that gnawed at her insides, tightening her chest with every breath. As she was led away, her expression remained unreadable, betraying nothing to the people who watched her leave. They would never know what it felt like to be torn apart in such a way. And yet, amidst the chaos and the whispers, there was one observer who did not shift her gaze from the judge, Agatha Marple, the elderly detective, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, every subtle movement, was as calm as ever. Her face was a mask of quiet observation, but her mind was already turning, piecing together the puzzle she had sensed from the start. The tension in the room was palpable, but there was something else, a deeper, darker undercurrent she couldn't ignore. The judge's actions were too deliberate, too precise. She had caught it in the way he moved, the way he dismissed Clara with barely a glance, the way his posture shifted when he thought no one was watching. There was something off, something that didn't sit right. Agatha stood still, letting the weight of the moment wash over her, letting the pieces of the puzzle settle into place. She had heard the murmurs earlier, the whispers about the judge's peculiar behavior, the undercurrent of strain that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was as if a weight had descended on him, something he couldn't shake. And now, as Clara's trial ended in a way that felt unjust, Agatha knew that this was just the beginning of something far more intricate. Her gaze shifted subtly toward the group of men gathered near the courthouse steps. Two figures stood apart from the crowd, one tall and angular, the other shorter with a ruddy face. They were speaking in low voices, but Agatha's keen ears caught their every word. "There's something wrong here," the tall one said, his voice a low murmur. "Something's off about this case. The judge, his ruling, it's too precise, too deliberate." The shorter man shook his head, his voice tinged with impatience. "You're overthinking it. The pressure's too much for him, that's all. He's been under stress ever since." He trailed off, as if realizing his slip, but Agatha had already caught it. Under stress since what? She thought, her pulse quickening. The taller man didn't answer, but his troubled expression spoke volumes. Agatha watched them for a moment longer, then moved toward them with casual grace. She was close enough to hear their voices, but not close enough to be noticed. A flicker of recognition passed between the two men as they began to walk away, but it was the rustling sound of the taller man's bag that caught Agatha's attention. Papers spilled from it, one of which, a tattered ledger, caught the light as it fell open. Agatha bent down to retrieve it, offering a polite smile as she handed it back. As their fingers brushed, she caught a glimpse of the page. Her eyes narrowed. The ledger wasn't just filled with names. It was a map, a roadmap of something darker, and there among the names was Clara Hastings, marked with a peculiar red circle. It stood out like a warning. No other name in the ledger bore such a mark, and Agatha felt the weight of it settle heavily on her chest. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. She watched as the man quickly snatched the ledger back, his expression tight with irritation, and snapped it shut with a finality that felt too rushed, too defensive. Agatha stood there, her mind already working over the implications. Clara Hastings wasn't just another case. She was part of something much larger, something that ran deeper than she could have imagined. Agatha's thoughts raced as she made her way toward the courthouse doors, her mind already piecing together the fragments she had gathered. Clara's case was just a thread, one that would lead her to the heart of a much darker mystery. The world of justice wasn't what it appeared to be, and Agatha Marple was going to find out exactly what lay beneath its polished surface. Agatha's hands, delicate yet firm, rested lightly on the worn leather strap of her handbag, her posture impeccable and composed. There was an almost imperceptible tightness in her grip, a subtle indication that her thoughts were far from the calm exterior she projected. "I did see," she replied, her voice smooth and deliberate, carrying a weight that suggested a deeper understanding than it revealed. "And I understand why you're upset. But you must remain calm, Miss Hastings. There's so much to be gained from clear thinking in moments like these." Clara's breath caught in her chest, her eyes wide with frustration and an urgent, unspoken plea for clarity. For a moment she appeared as if she might burst into another protest, but the moment was abruptly interrupted. Bellamy, ever the cautious one, placed a steadying hand on her trembling shoulder. His voice, though soft, held an undercurrent of authority, a reminder of the power dynamics at play. "Miss Hastings," he said, his tone firm yet reassuring. "You must trust me. These wild accusations, your anger will do more harm than good. We need to remain measured, no matter how deeply your emotions run." Agatha inclined her head ever so slightly, her lips curving into the barest of smiles, one that carried an unspoken understanding. "The truth," she said, her words almost a whisper, "has a way of revealing itself, Miss Hastings. Hold on to your strength for just a little while longer." Clara's gaze lingered on Agatha for a moment, as if seeking something solid to cling to in the midst of her storm. There was a faint flicker of something, perhaps trust, before she allowed herself to be led away by Bellamy. Her shoulders drooped in exhaustion, and as she disappeared down the corridor, she cast one last lingering glance over her shoulder at Agatha, as if trying to find some flicker of hope in her presence. As the sound of her footsteps faded into the chaotic hum of the courthouse, Agatha stood still, her posture unshaken. Her mind, sharp as ever, began to sift through the fragments of the puzzle she had observed throughout the day. The judge's unusual haste, the subtle unease among the court clerks, and Clara's impassioned protest. None of it added up to a simple trial gone awry. Something much more intricate, far more dangerous, was unfolding beneath the surface. Agatha adjusted her scarf with deliberate care, her fingers brushing the fabric as she turned towards the stairs, her eyes now gleaming with the glint of someone on the verge of uncovering a hidden truth. She moved through the quieter upper corridors of the courthouse, the sounds of the bustling courtroom below fading into a muted hum. This section of the building felt different, older, more solemn. The heavy wooden doors lined the passage like silent sentinels, their gleaming brass nameplates catching the dim afternoon light. Each step she took was measured, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, echoing in the stillness of the corridor. The cream scarf she held in her hands was nothing more than a flimsy excuse for her presence here, but it served its purpose, drawing no suspicion as she paused near a door marked Judge H. Whitmore. It was a slight movement, a barely perceptible shift in the angle of her body, that drew her attention to the gap between the door and its frame. Through it, Agatha caught a glimpse of the judge's chambers. The room was darkly appointed, with rich wood paneling that seemed to absorb the light from the flickering fire. The glow from the hearth cast long shadows on the shelves of legal tomes that lined the walls. Her gaze flicked to the desk, where, barely visible beneath a mound of papers, lay a letter. Its distinctive seal, a crest encircled by Latin text, immediately drew her attention. It was the kind of seal used by old, well-established families with influence in the highest echelons of society. Agatha's sharp eyes narrowed as she tried to make out the contents of the letter, but the writing was too faint to decipher from her position. Still, the presence of the seal, so deliberately placed in the judge's chambers, set her nerves alight. She tilted her head slightly, pondering whether the letter had been left there intentionally, perhaps for someone to find, or whether it was simply carelessness. Before she could indulge her thoughts further, the sudden sound of hurried footsteps interrupted her train of thought. The clerk, a young man with sandy hair and an anxious, perpetually flustered air, stepped into view from behind the desk. His face flushed the moment he saw her standing there, and he hastily reached for the door, intent on closing it. "Madame," he said in a voice that cracked just slightly with nervousness, "you shouldn't be here." Agatha, unfazed, remained where she stood, her posture unyielding yet radiating a quiet authority. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said, her tone smooth and measured, like the warmth of a gentle breeze. "I was just looking for my scarf. How clumsy of me. I thought it may have blown in here somehow." The clerk hesitated, his hand still on the door, and for an instant there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Was he unsure whether to reprimand her or to apologize for the interruption? Agatha's expression remained serene, her eyes unwavering as she allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Finally he relented. "I don't see anything of the sort, madame. Please, if you wouldn't mind," he said, his voice strained. "Of course," Agatha replied, nodding graciously. "I'm terribly sorry to trouble you." She made a show of stepping back, her eyes briefly darting to the desk where the letter, now hastily concealed beneath a blotter, was hidden from view. Her mind raced with new questions. What was so important about this letter? Why had the clerk reacted with such nervousness? What role did the judge play in all of this? With a final polite nod, Agatha turned away, adjusting her scarf as if nothing had occurred. Her footsteps echoed softly down the corridor as she walked away, but her thoughts remained locked in the confines of the chambers she had just visited. That evening, as the sky darkened over the village and the first of the street lamps flickered to life, Agatha sat in her sitting room, a fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth. But despite the warmth of the room, her mind was cold with suspicion. She sat there, knitting needles idle beside her, the wool resting untouched, like the mystery that hung in the air. The image of the letter with its distinctive seal, the clerk's flustered demeanor, and the judge's cold, aloof presence in court all swirled in her mind. It wasn't enough to form a concrete theory, but it was enough to sow the seed of doubt, to make her question what was truly happening behind the scenes. As the firelight flickered and danced across the room, Agatha's mind pieced together the subtle details. Each clue, each hesitation, and she knew without a doubt that this case was far more complex than it appeared. The judge's refusal to meet Clara Hastings' gaze, his abrupt manner, and the strange urgency of the entire situation, all of it pointed to something hidden beneath the surface, something Agatha Marple was determined to uncover. The judge's rulings had always carried a certain rhythm, an almost mechanical precision, that gave the impression of a man who had everything under control. But as Agatha stood in the dimly lit hallway, the letter with its distinctive seal, a crest surrounded by ancient Latin text, lingered in her mind. It was not just the letter that unsettled her, but the connection it suggested, one far more intricate than mere procedural protocol. Her gaze fell on the flickering flames in the hearth, the crackling warmth offering little comfort as her mind raced with possibilities. The judge, with his stern demeanor and almost unnerving calm, seemed like a man who held the power to manipulate the entire courtroom with a glance. Yet, beneath that facade of control, there was a story buried deep, one that Agatha was determined to uncover. She allowed herself a faint smile, fingers instinctively reaching for the knitting needles beside her, their soft clink, the only sound in the otherwise quiet room as she resumed her steady, calm work. She had been to the upper corridors of the courthouse earlier, a place far removed from the chaotic courtroom below, where heavy wooden doors lined the passage, their brass nameplates gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. Agatha had paused at one particular door, Judge H. Whitmore's, where a faint draft had revealed a slightly ajar entrance. Through the narrow gap, she had glimpsed a room filled with dark paneled walls lined with legal books, the fire casting long shadows over the shelves. On the desk, barely visible beneath a pile of papers, was the letter with its distinctive seal. Agatha's sharp eyes had noted the crest at once, its design suggesting a connection to old influential families, something that hinted at deep-rooted ties to power. As she had tried to make out the letter's contents, the sudden appearance of the judge's clerk, young, anxious and perpetually flustered, had interrupted her. The clerk, his face flushed with discomfort, had tried to close the door hastily when he saw her standing there. Agatha, unruffled, had maintained her composure, apologizing for what seemed like a trivial mistake. The clerk, unsure whether to be stern or apologetic, had relented, only for Agatha to take a fleeting glance at the desk, where the letter had been hastily hidden. There was something about the clerk's nervousness that struck her as odd, almost as if he knew something that he was unwilling to share. That evening, as darkness settled over the village and the street lamps flickered to life, Agatha sat by the fire, her knitting untouched, her mind replaying the events of the day. The clerk's flustered demeanor, the unusual seal on the letter, and the judge's detached behavior all nagged at her thoughts. It was not enough to draw a solid conclusion, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in her mind. She considered the judge's aloofness in court, his refusal to meet Clara Hastings' gaze, and his quick, almost robotic rulings, Everything seemed too precise, too calculated. That letter, though, suggested something much deeper. A connection that wasn't just procedural. Agatha's fingers absently traced the edge of her knitting needles as she thought about the judge's role in this whole affair. The story beneath his controlled exterior was one she would uncover, no matter how long it took. With a soft sigh, she resumed her work. The quiet clink of the needles, the only sound in the room, her thoughts still far away, caught in the web of mystery that now surrounded her. The clerk's office had been her next stop, a cramped, dimly lit space at the far end of the courthouse, where mismatched ledgers and bound files towered like forgotten monuments to legal history. The single desk lamp cast a weak yellow light on the cluttered desk, illuminating ink-stained blotters and well-worn documents. Agatha had entered, her presence immediately commanding attention, her tailored jacket and sensible hat giving her an air of quiet authority. The young clerk, with his perpetually frazzled expression, had looked up from his papers, his nervousness palpable. "May I help you, madam?" he had asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Agatha, with a polite smile, had leaned in slightly, her voice calm yet firm. "I certainly hope so," she had said, her eyes never leaving his. She had no doubt now. There was something far deeper at play here, and she would unravel it, piece by piece. Every clue, every hesitation was a puzzle she was determined to solve. The pieces were coming together, and Agatha Marple was no stranger to the art of connecting them. As Agatha continued her journey through the winding halls of the courthouse, her mind whirred with the new fragments of information she had gathered, each one settling into place like a piece of an intricate puzzle. The clerk, although he tried to maintain a veneer of composure, had unwittingly divulged more than he intended. His nervous movements, his fidgeting with the fountain pen, his glance toward the door, all spoke volumes. He had almost let slip a truth that had barely been disguised in the form of office gossip. The word bribe had lingered in the air like a thick fog, and Agatha's instincts, sharp and unwavering, told her that there was far more to this situation than simple rumors. The mention of Judge Whitmore's personal struggles, and the veiled references to potential corruption, had all been far too telling. Agatha, ever composed, stopped for a moment just outside the clerk's office. Her fingers grazed the wooden doorframe as her thoughts spiraled deeper into the mystery. She couldn't help but smile softly, though it was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it. It was a smile of satisfaction, yes, but also one of certainty. She had barely scratched the surface, and already she could feel the tendrils of something darker, more complex, curling beneath the facts. She knew there was more. There always was. She turned on her heel, her gait purposeful, her mind racing with questions she needed answers to. The weight of the information she'd gathered hung on her like an invisible cloak, urging her to move swiftly. Each step seemed to echo through the empty hallways, reminding her that this case, this puzzle, was far from simple. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a cool twilight, Agatha made her way toward Morton's coffee house. It was an unassuming place, tucked away on a quiet street, but tonight, it felt like the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. Inside, the dim lighting cast long shadows over the patrons who sat in quiet conversation. The clink of coffee cups, the low hum of the room, seemed like distant sounds as Agatha's eyes locked on Mr. Bellamy, seated by the window. His thin frame, hunched over his untouched brandy, spoke of a man with too many things on his mind. Agatha moved with quiet grace, her steps measured, as she approached him. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of curiosity. "I hope I'm not keeping you too late." He stood with a slight nod, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Not at all, Mrs. Marple. I appreciate you taking the time to meet me. It's a difficult matter." Agatha settled into the chair, her gaze fixed on him, studying him with a sharpness that seemed to dissect every movement, every small gesture. She knew the kind of man Bellamy was: restless, driven, yet careful in his words. He adjusted his glasses, a habitual movement that betrayed his inner turmoil. She couldn't help but notice the nervous tapping of his fingers on the table, a subtle but telling sign that something was troubling him deeply. He sighed, pushing the glasses up his nose, before speaking in a low, almost bitter tone. That ruling, excluding the diary as evidence, it's completely unjustifiable, don't you think? The diary contained direct contradictions to the prosecution's timeline. Dates, notes, even letters. And yet, they struck it down as inadmissible. It makes no sense. His voice tightened with frustration as he continued, his lips curling into a thin line. And then there's the witness. Poor Mr. Farrell. Just gone. Too convenient, don't you think? Vanishing at the last moment right when his testimony could have changed everything. Agatha listened intently, her expression neutral, but her mind racing. She could sense the underlying tension in his words, the faintest trace of fear mixed with anger. Something wasn't adding up, and Bellamy knew it. His eyes darted to the door, as if expecting someone to enter at any moment, before he turned his gaze back to her. There was a hesitance in his voice now, a soft reluctance to delve too deeply into dangerous waters. Have you found any explanation for these events? Agatha's voice was smooth, yet there was an intensity behind her words that made it clear she wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. Bellamy shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. I've been trying, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But, his words trailed off, leaving the silence to settle between them like a thick fog. Agatha's gaze never wavered from his face. She could see it, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way he was struggling to hold something back. There was more here, far more than what he was letting on. But, she prompted gently. Bellamy hesitated again, his fingers tapping against the table once more, his mind clearly torn between divulging what he knew and holding back for his own safety. There are things I've uncovered, he said at last, his voice barely audible. Things that suggest there's a lot more going on than anyone realizes. But if I'm wrong, he broke off, looking around as if the walls themselves might be listening. Agatha leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? She asked, her voice now barely above a whisper. Bellamy seemed to debate with himself for a moment longer before speaking again. I can't say for certain, but I think Whitmore is tangled up in something much deeper. And I don't know who I can trust. He trailed off, his shoulders tense, his face pale. Agatha's mind raced. There were too many contradictions, too many loose ends that didn't tie up. The diary, the witness's sudden disappearance, and now Bellamy's cryptic warnings. All of it pointed towards something much larger, more dangerous than a simple case of judicial corruption. She stood, her movement fluid and deliberate. I'll look into it, she said softly. But be careful, Mr. Bellamy. This is bigger than either of us can imagine. As she turned to leave, the weight of the mystery pressing down on her like a storm cloud, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover a truth that would shake the very foundation of the case. Each step she took toward the door seemed to echo louder in her mind, marking the beginning of a journey that would lead her into the darkest corners of corruption and deceit. The judge's word was final, a legal decree that seemed impenetrable, but Agatha wasn't one to be deterred by mere authority. What can I do? She thought, her mind ticking relentlessly. The judge's decision stands, and without undeniable proof, accusing him of undue influence would be nothing more than reckless speculation. Her hands resting lightly on the table, clenched as the tension within her deepened. But as her thoughts swirled, Bellamy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's something odd, he said, eyes darting to make sure no one was listening. An old acquaintance of the judge, Harrove, a businessman, a financier of questionable ventures. He was seen outside the courthouse just before the trial began. Agatha's brow furrowed slightly, her interest piqued. Harrove, she repeated, her voice level, though the flicker of curiosity in her eyes betrayed her interest. Who exactly is he? Bellamy shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how much to reveal. Not the kind of person you'd expect to find near a court of law. His dealings, shady at best. His words were carefully measured, but Agatha could sense the weight of what he was implying. And what of his involvement with the judge? She asked, pressing for more. Bellamy's voice dropped lower still, almost inaudible. It's strange. The timing. Harrow's presence at the courthouse coincided with the judge's increasingly odd rulings. As soon as he appeared, things started to take a turn. Agatha nodded, absorbing his words. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but she needed more. Did you speak to him? She inquired. Bellamy hesitated, the look in his eyes betraying his frustration. I tried, he murmured, but he vanished before I could get close. It's as though he didn't want to be found. The timing of it all, too deliberate. Agatha studied him for a long moment before responding, her tone thoughtful. Indeed, timing can be a most curious thing. With that, the conversation dwindled, and as Bellamy left with a murmur of apology, Agatha remained behind. Her fingers absently traced the rim of her teacup, her mind working furiously. Harrow, an elusive figure, a potential lead, but not the answer. The following day, Agatha pursued the lead with a quiet determination. A few well-placed inquiries led her to a nondescript office in the financial district, where records of investments and trade deals filled neatly stacked files. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate, but as she dug deeper, whispers of shady dealings and failed ventures surfaced, adding a layer of intrigue to the businessman's already questionable reputation. Her search took her to an associate of Harrow's, a smooth-talking clerk who spoke in veiled terms, hinting at departures under less than ideal circumstances. Despite the hints of impropriety, Agatha couldn't find any direct connection between Harrow and the trial. His dealings, though shady, appeared to be entirely separate from the judge's conduct. There was no concrete link. Frustrated, Agatha reflected on her findings in the comfort of her sitting room later that evening. Harrow, it seemed, was nothing more than a distraction, a red herring meant to lead her astray. The real story lay elsewhere, in the strange rulings, the missing evidence, and the vanished witness. Harrow wasn't the key. Agatha's thoughts turned to the other pieces she'd gathered, those elusive threads she was sure would weave together to reveal the truth. The next day, she found herself at the city library, a sprawling maze of mahogany shelves and musty air. The golden afternoon light filtered through arched windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stillness. Sitting at a long oak table, surrounded by yellowing ledgers and brittle newspapers, Agatha seemed like any other researcher, but her keen grey eyes were sharp, scanning each page with the precision of a jeweler examining diamonds. She paused, her fingers delicately turning a fragile page as she scanned the entries. Her gaze stopped on a familiar name, Blackstone and Son. The name rang a bell, though it had been years since she last encountered it. The next page confirmed her suspicion. The judge, Whitmore, had once been involved with the company, serving on its board before its catastrophic bankruptcy in 1895. Agatha's lips curled slightly in a small, quiet victory. The judge's ties to Blackstone and Sons were no accident. But the story didn't end there. Agatha traced the ripples of Blackstone's collapse, finding its financial devastation had ruined several families, particularly the Littons. The name sent a cold shiver through her. The late Mrs. Whitmore had been a Litton, and her family had been among those financially ruined by the bankruptcy. As Agatha dug deeper, she uncovered a shocking detail. The judge's father-in-law had been a silent partner in Blackstone, pouring his fortune into the doomed venture. It was clear that the judge had been involved in the family's ruin, either directly or indirectly. The realization hit Agatha like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a case of judicial misconduct. It was a tangled web of personal loss, family betrayal, and a thirst for revenge. Agatha leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. The judge's strange rulings, his ties to a long-buried financial scandal, the ruined families. Everything was connected. And the more she uncovered, the darker the mystery grew. She could feel the storm approaching, the storm that would reveal the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. Agatha sat back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her now cold teacup, as she pondered the growing stack of papers in front of her. Every document seemed to add a new wrinkle to the mystery, yet none brought her any closer to the truth. She turned to the most recent article, a financial review that mentioned a name she had hoped never to see again: Blackstone. But this time it wasn't the same Blackstone. It had morphed into a new modern entity, a holding company behind a rapidly expanding export business. The timeline was too precise to be mere coincidence. The company had only recently emerged, just as Clara Hastings' trial began to dominate the headlines. It had received a substantial investment, almost as if someone had known exactly when to capitalize on the trial's unfolding drama. Agatha leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. The old Blackstone name had a history tied to Judge Whitmore's family, one that had caused untold ruin. Now it was back, but under a different guise, flourishing in the shadow of the very trial that had seemingly ignited its resurgence. The intertwining of the past and present was no longer something she could ignore. This was no simple coincidence. It was a financial rebirth, tied to the fate of the Whitmore family and Clara Hastings' conviction. There was more at play here than just a trial. This was a manipulation of events, a deep web of influence. Agatha felt her pulse quicken as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to align. She knew she was onto something significant, though the full picture remained out of reach. The past was never truly distant, and in this case, it cast an ominous shadow that stretched far into the present. Her mind raced through the possibilities, wondering how deep this rabbit hole went. Meanwhile, the courthouse, a stone's throw away, stood in stark contrast to her mounting tension. The evening was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of clerks working late in the administrative wing, their figures bent under the dim light of gas lamps. The distant clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone streets, barely registered as Agatha's footsteps echoed in the hallways. She had come to meet Mr. Evelyn Monteague, the treasurer for the Courthouse Restoration Fund. Monteague, a portly man with a ruddy complexion, greeted her warmly, but with a noticeable edge of distraction. He was a man who had seen many things in his years of service, but Agatha could sense that something in her inquiry was striking too close to home. As they exchanged pleasantries, she casually steered the conversation toward the recent anonymous donation that had poured funds into the restoration project. Monteague's reaction was swift, a touch too eager, a bit too rehearsed. His voice was smooth, but his eyes betrayed a nervousness that did not escape Agatha's notice. "Ah yes, the donation," he began, puffing out his chest in an attempt to project confidence. "Quite an extraordinary boon to our efforts, but the benefactor insisted on strict anonymity. I know no more than you, I'm afraid." Agatha raised an eyebrow, her tone light but her gaze sharp. "I've heard whispers," she said, "that perhaps the donor was Mr. Abibel Harcourt, known for his philanthropy, and I believe an acquaintance of Judge Whitmore. Surely you've heard the rumors." The mention of Harcourt's name caused a noticeable shift in Monteague's demeanor. His usual calm faltered as he paused, his hand instinctively reaching for his waistcoat pocket to retrieve a handkerchief, dabbing at his brow. "Harcourt, you say?" he muttered, his voice dropping slightly. "Well, his name has been mentioned, but I have no confirmation of that. Harcourt, I understand, has been out of the country for some time. South America, I believe." Agatha nodded thoughtfully, her eyes never leaving Monteague. "Indeed, I heard he was in Montevideo, but someone of his means could certainly arrange a donation from afar, don't you think?" Monteague shifted in his chair, his gaze flickering toward the scattered papers on his desk, his composure cracking slightly. "It would be a pleasant thought," he said, with a forced chuckle. "But Harcourt has a solid alibi. He's been in Montevideo since before the donation was made. I even received a letter from him last week, bragging about some grand project he's funding down there." Agatha allowed a small knowing smile to cross her lips. "How interesting," she replied softly. "And the donation, no accompanying notes or clues?" Monteague's hand made another flourish with the handkerchief, his nervousness becoming more pronounced. "None," he said, almost too quickly. "Just a tidy sum delivered through proper channels, no questions asked. A godsend, really. I've long since stopped trying to guess who's behind it. Agatha nodded, her voice pleasant, but the wheels in her mind were turning faster than ever. Indeed, she said, rising from her seat. Montague stood to see her off, all smiles again. But Agatha could feel the thin veil of politeness, barely covering his discomfort. As she stepped out of his office and into the dimly lit hallway, she couldn't help but reflect on the meeting. Montague's response had been telling, flustered, defensive and far too eager to dismiss her suspicions. His claim of Harcourt's absence seemed solid at first, but Agatha knew better than to take things at face value. His reaction to the mention of the donation, the way he avoided direct answers, there was more here than met the eye. As she moved back through the quiet courthouse, the flickering gas lamps casting long shadows along the corridor, Agatha couldn't shake the feeling that she was being steered toward yet another dead end. But that was the thing about mysteries. They never ended with a clear answer. No, this was simply another layer of deception, one that she would need to peel away carefully. She had followed the clues only to find herself in the same place. But now, with every question she asked, the shadows grew darker, and the truth, though elusive, seemed to be just within her grasp. As Agatha descended the staircase, her gloved hand resting lightly on the cool, polished banister, a flicker of realization tugged at the edges of her mind. Something Montague had said, perhaps without realizing its significance, had opened a new thread in the tangled web of secrets she had been unraveling. Her expression remained outwardly calm, but inwardly, her thoughts spun rapidly. She paused, her eyes briefly scanning the dim hallway before her, and then continued with deliberate steps, each one taking her further into a web of intrigue that refused to loosen its grip. The courthouse was crowded, the high windows casting long shadows as cold daylight poured in, illuminating the anxious faces of the spectators who filled every bench, their whispers rising in a collective hum of nervous anticipation. A row of reporters sat hunched over their notepads, poised like vultures waiting for a morsel of truth to spill from the proceedings. The tension was palpable, a suffocating weight pressing down on the air. At precisely 2 p.m., Agatha entered the room, her presence barely more than a ripple in the heavy silence that enveloped the space. She moved with purpose, her every motion sharp and measured, as though her entrance had been meticulously rehearsed. She took her place in the front row, the eyes of the courtroom turning instinctively toward her, drawn by the quiet force of her demeanor. It was a rare moment when Agatha's presence was both commanding and serene, as though the very air bent around her. The court session began with the customary formality, the judge entering in his robes, his expression stern, his posture one of unyielding authority. He surveyed the room with the air of someone who had long since convinced himself of his own infallibility. Clara Hastings was led to the defendant's table, her face pale, but unwavering in its composure. Beside her, her defense attorney, Mr. Bellamy, shuffled through his papers with an air of barely concealed panic. Agatha's gaze was steady as she surveyed the scene, her small figure an island of calm amidst the rising storm of tension. When her moment arrived, she stood with poised deliberation, the silence thickening around her. Her words, when they came, were soft yet unmistakably clear. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "I stand before you not as a lawyer, but as a citizen seeking truth, seeking justice. My only purpose here is to shed light on the connections that have until now remained hidden." The weight of her words settled over the room like a dense fog, causing even the faintest rustle of paper to cease. She opened the slim, bound folder she held in her hands, its contents seemingly insignificant to the untrained eye. But as she spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Within this folder," Agatha continued, her tone unyielding, "are documents that I believe reveal a connection crucial to this case, a connection that until now has been ignored." The judge's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he leveled a steely gaze at her. "Mrs. Marple," he interjected sharply, his voice laced with authority, "this court operates under strict rules. If you intend to make accusations, you must present them properly." Agatha's eyes never wavered. "I ask only that you allow me to present the facts," she replied smoothly, her calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the tension rippling through the room. After a long heavy pause, the judge finally nodded, allowing her to proceed. The courtroom's attention was fully captured as Agatha opened the folder and began to reveal its contents, each page seemingly more damning than the last. "These records," she began, her voice unwavering, "show that you, Your Honor, once served as a director of Blackstone and Sons, a company whose spectacular collapse in the 1890s left a trail of ruin for many families, not the least of which was your late wife's family." The room gasped collectively, and even the judge's features tightened, though he remained silent. "What is more troubling," Agatha continued, her gaze unwavering, "is that these same records reveal an anonymous benefactor, who shortly after the collapse, began providing substantial financial support to your wife's family. These payments, though initially obscure, follow a distinct pattern, one that seems deliberately hidden." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle. The judge's face had drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Agatha's voice, when it rose again, carried a note of quiet precision. "This in itself may not be damning, Your Honor, but a closer look at recent transactions reveals something far more troubling." She slid another document across the table, her fingers brushing lightly over it. "The name Blackstone, thought erased from history, has resurfaced, now connected to a modern holding company that benefited directly from Clara Hastings' conviction. Funds flowed through intermediaries, carefully concealed, to those with clear financial interests in ensuring her guilt." The audience reacted with audible shock, murmurs filling the space like a growing storm. Agatha's gaze never left the judge's face, her eyes steady and cold. "I do not suggest that you personally orchestrated this, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "but the evidence clearly suggests that your actions were influenced by those with far more to gain than you could have ever imagined." The judge's face flushed crimson, his voice rising in anger. "This is preposterous," he thundered. "I have acted with impartiality at every stage. I have nothing to do with any of this." Agatha remained unshaken. "Perhaps you believed that, Your Honor," she said, her voice gentle but cutting. "But the trail is clear. The payments were disguised, the names altered, the figures manipulated, but the connection remains. Those who sought to control you relied on your integrity, your sense of duty. They knew you would never question them, and they used that trust to manipulate the course of justice itself." The judge's grip on his bench tightened even further, and for a moment, Agatha wondered if the weight of his guilt was starting to seep through his carefully crafted facade. The courtroom was silent, waiting for his response, yet Agatha knew that in this moment, her work was far from over. The truth was unfolding, but the shadow of power was still very much alive. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker, each breath held as if the very walls were waiting to collapse under the weight of the truth. Agatha Marple stood before the judge, her figure as poised and unyielding as a statue, a sharp contrast to the uncertainty clouding the courtroom. Her gloved hands resting lightly on the folder that contained the explosive evidence, seemed to hold the fate of the trial in their delicate grip. The judge, a once mighty figure of unquestioned authority, now appeared frail, his fingers trembling slightly as he clutched the gavel that once seemed to command absolute power. Agatha's calm gaze swept across the room, her eyes never wavering, as she prepared to speak, each word calculated with surgical precision. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft yet imbued with an undeniable strength, "I understand that you believed you were protecting a legacy, your late wife's memory, but what you failed to see was that in your efforts, you were unknowingly serving the interests of those who would use your integrity for their own gain." The words hung in the air, chilling in their finality, as the judge's face paled and his grip on the gavel tightened. Agatha had struck a nerve. His mind raced, but his body could no longer disguise the cracks that had begun to form in his previously impenetrable facade. The weight of his mistakes pressed upon him with each passing second, and he opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, unable to fully escape. He had been played, and the realization settled like ice in his chest. Agatha did not flinch, her voice unwavering as she continued. "You were led astray, Your Honor. It wasn't loyalty or duty that guided you, but manipulation, a series of unseen hands pulling the strings of your every decision." Her words seemed to echo in the charged silence, and the room collectively held its breath. For a moment it seemed as though time itself had paused, waiting for the judge's next move. He leaned back in his chair, his face drawn, and his eyes focused on a point beyond the reach of the room, as if seeking solace in something far off and unreachable. His voice faltered when he spoke again, a mere shadow of the authority it had once held. I thought I was preserving her legacy." The words hung in the air, a confession wrapped in uncertainty. Agatha's response was gentle, almost sympathetic, as she nodded slowly, acknowledging the complexity of the judge's position. "I know you believed that, Your Honor, but in your pursuit of honor, you lost sight of the truth, and now it is the truth that will set everything right." The judge's hand trembled as he let the gavel slip from his grasp, the hollow sound of it hitting the bench reverberating through the room like a final judgment. The courtroom held its collective breath, the tension palpable in the air, before a new and unexpected weight seemed to lift. The judge's emotional collapse had given way to something even more crucial, the chance for the truth to finally emerge. Clara Hastings, once a woman condemned to an unjust fate, now stood taller, her shoulders squared with newfound hope. The cold light of morning filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow over her face, now marked not by despair, but by the quiet resolve of someone who had been granted a second chance. Agatha, ever composed, sat beside Clara, her gaze steady and focused as the new proceedings unfolded. Mr. Bellamy, still in disbelief, shuffled his papers, unable to hide his surprise at the sudden shift in fortune. The atmosphere in the courtroom was different now, charged with something far more powerful than the weight of accusations. It was the weight of vindication, as the judge's gavel once again echoed through the courtroom, this time marking the reopening of Clara's case. A wave of anticipation rippled through the room. The new evidence, carefully presented by Agatha, began to unravel the intricate web of manipulation that had been woven around Clara's conviction. Each piece of evidence, carefully placed like a puzzle, revealed the ugly truth behind the conspiracy. The men who had orchestrated Clara's downfall, those who had played the court and manipulated the judge, were revealed in full light. They had used Clara as a pawn in a larger scheme, one that was driven by greed and ambition, not malice. Their goal had been to secure lucrative government contracts for the revived Blackstone Company, using Clara's conviction to pave the way for their financial windfall. It was a cold, calculated plot, and Clara had been nothing more than collateral damage. The new judge, a visiting magistrate known for his impartiality, listened intently as Agatha laid out the damning facts. The once vibrant legal battle had now been reduced to a series of calculated moves. As the truth came crashing through the veil of deceit, the defense presented a compelling timeline, connecting the dots between the industrial interests and the court's manipulation. As the final pieces clicked into place, the judge made his decision. In light of the overwhelming evidence, he stated firmly, "The conviction of Clara Hastings is hereby overturned." The room erupted into whispers, gasps of disbelief, and tentative hope. Clara's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, her breath shaky as though she had been holding it for an eternity. When she opened them, her gaze sought Agatha, who nodded approvingly, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions surrounding them. Clara finally allowed herself a small, victorious smile, the relief washing over her like a cleansing tide. But the story did not end there. Agatha's investigation had unearthed something even more sinister than a mere wrongful conviction. Beneath the surface of Clara's trial lay a conspiracy that spanned decades, involving powerful men who had used their influence to manipulate the very fabric of justice. These men, the industrialists, had carefully orchestrated Clara's downfall, planting false evidence, coercing witnesses, and nudging the judge toward decisions that served their financial interests. They had used every trick in the book to secure their profits at the expense of an innocent woman's life. When confronted with this knowledge, Judge Whitmore, once a man of unshakable conviction, found himself shattered. The weight of his decisions, guided by his belief in preserving his late wife's legacy, had led him down a dark path of manipulation. His resignation was quiet, but his actions afterward spoke volumes. He provided critical testimony, using his knowledge to expose those who had used him for their gain. His once formidable presence in the courtroom had now shifted, serving a new purpose: to ensure that those who had orchestrated the conspiracy were held accountable. Through Agatha's relentless pursuit of truth, a new chapter in the saga of justice began to unfold, one where the powerful were no longer immune from the consequences of their actions. Explanation. In this expansion, the psychological depth of the judge's internal conflict is intensified, showing the emotional and moral toll of his role in the conspiracy. Agatha's calm, calculated demeanor is emphasized, showcasing her as a figure of steady authority amid the chaos. The manipulation behind Clara's conviction is elaborated, and the judge's resignation and transformation into a whistleblower are explored in more detail. The suspense and mystery elements are enhanced by further revealing the shadowy figures behind the conspiracy, leading to a more intricate and intense narrative. The courtroom, once an arena for unyielding justice, now felt like a battleground, heavy with the ghosts of secrets that had been buried too long. Agatha Marple, poised and unwavering, stood in the dim light of the corridor outside, her gloved hands clutching a stack of meticulously organized documents. The case had turned, the wheels of truth slowly grinding away the layers of deception. Clara Hastings walked free that day, but not without leaving behind a trail of questions and shadows. As Clara stepped into the daylight, her eyes met Agatha's, gratitude and disbelief mingling in her expression. "You believed me," Clara said, her voice a mix of astonishment and raw emotion. Agatha's smile, faint but steady, did not falter. "Sometimes, the truth just needs a little light," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that only those who had witnessed the darkest depths of deception could understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden haze over the oak-paneled drawing room where Agatha sat, the clock ticked away the passing moments. Bellamy, the defense attorney, whose courtroom persona had dissolved into the quiet man seated across from her, seemed as if he had aged 10 years in the span of this one trial. His pince-nez glasses, tucked away for the evening, lay forgotten beside him, his fingers nervously tapping against his knee. "I understand your reservations, Mrs. Marple," Bellamy began, his voice calm yet laden with a persuasive undercurrent. "But consider the alternative. Yes, Judge Whitmore made grave mistakes, mistakes that have cost us dearly, but they weren't born from malice. Misguided loyalty, perhaps, a desire to protect something he believed in, something dear to him. But malice? No, he was simply deceived, just as Clara was." Agatha's steady gaze never wavered, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her silence inviting him to continue. "We could ruin him, expose him for the mistakes he's made," Bellamy said, his voice growing more earnest, "and maybe it would send a message to others who think they are above the law. But at what cost? Whitmore still holds the keys to dismantling the true villains behind this scheme. He still has the power, the connections and the knowledge we need to put things right. Without him, all we've uncovered might come to nothing." Agatha's mind worked through the labyrinth of choices laid before her. She had seen the truth in Whitmore's eyes, the shock, the guilt, the crumbling of a man who had been so certain of his righteousness. His remorse was genuine, but could it undo the harm done? "You're asking for forgiveness, Mr. Bellamy," Agatha said, her tone measured yet contemplative. "But is that enough? The law is supposed to be a sharp tool, cutting through the murkiness of intent to deliver justice. But you're right, people are messy, they carry burdens, they falter, and it's those falterings that make them human." That evening, Agatha sat alone in her sitting room, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles serving as a subtle counterpoint to the whirl of thoughts racing through her mind. Judge Whitmore's motivations had been clouded by a misguided sense of duty, his every action rooted in his desire to preserve the memory of his late wife. But at what cost? His failure to see the manipulation, the exploitation, had set into motion a cascade of consequences. Agatha's thoughts circled back to the heart of the matter. Justice wasn't about punishing the guilty alone, it was about making things right, about restoring balance in a world where the powerful too often held all the cards. The next morning, she met with Bellamy again, her decision lingering in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. "I've considered your argument, Mr. Bellamy," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Let him stay, under supervision. If Judge Whitmore is willing to testify, and help us expose those who truly orchestrated this entire conspiracy, then I see no reason to cast him aside. True justice, after all, must leave room for redemption. Bellamy's relief was palpable, a heavy exhale of breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thank you, Mrs. Marple. This is the best course for all of us. Agatha adjusted her gloves, standing with a quiet grace, her eyes meeting his one last time. Don't thank me, she said softly, her tone almost conspiratorial. Thank the truth. It has a way of guiding us, even when we don't know we're following it. With that she turned and left, her sensible shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor as she walked out of the drawing room. Judge Whitmore's office, once a place of rigid authority, had transformed into something entirely different. The heavy oak shelves still stood, filled with records that told stories of decisions past, but now, the air felt different. There was a shift, a quiet acknowledgement, that this place, this institution, was not immune to change. Whitmore, now fully aware of his role in the conspiracy, sat at his desk, his eyes darkened with the burden of his past decisions. The knowledge he now possessed was more than mere information. It was power. The power to undo the damage he had caused, to atone for the manipulation that had taken place under his watch. As Agatha had predicted, the truth had a way of revealing itself, like a shadow emerging from behind a curtain. Whitmore's actions had been born not of malevolent intent, but of a deep misguided belief in the righteousness of his cause. Now he had the chance to make it right. The following days brought a renewed sense of purpose to the courtroom. The pieces of the conspiracy began to fall into place, each new revelation unfolding like a dark, twisted puzzle. The real villains, the men behind the scheme to profit from Clara's conviction, were exposed one by one, their motives laid bare. The industrialists, driven by greed, had manipulated the system, planting false evidence, coercing witnesses, and using Judge Whitmore's vulnerability to secure their financial interests. It was a cold, calculated plan, and Clara had been nothing more than a pawn in their game. Agatha, ever the mastermind, had unraveled their scheme with precision, turning the tide of the trial in Clara's favor. As the gavel came down, it wasn't just the end of a case, it was the end of an era where the powerful could dictate the fates of the innocent without consequence. Explanation. This expansion builds on the original script's flow and tone, making the internal struggle of the characters, especially Judge Whitmore and Agatha, more complex. The mystery and suspense are heightened through a deeper exploration of Whitmore's motivations, and the conspiracy behind Clara's conviction. Agatha's calm, calculated approach is emphasized, and her ability to see through the layers of deceit is brought to the forefront. The expansion also enhances the resolution, showing a more detailed process of how the conspiracy unravels, and the consequences that follow, while keeping the core message of justice, redemption and truth intact. The courtroom, once filled with tense whispers, now seemed almost serene as the final gavel fell. Yet, beneath the calm there lingered an unspoken weight of actions, decisions and a past that had been irrevocably altered. Judge Whitmore, a man who had once ruled with unquestionable authority, now sat behind his desk with a heaviness in his eyes, his hands folded before him, as if bracing for the burden of what had been revealed. His voice, though steady, carried an unmistakable edge of resolve as he spoke to his advisers. From this day forward, he declared, his words cutting through the silence, no case shall stand unexamined. Every verdict, every action taken must be scrutinized. We will not shy away from our failures, but confront them head-on. Let the truth guide us, even if it leads us to uncomfortable places. The air in the room shifted as his team nodded in agreement, pens scratching across pages. The once imposing man was now a figure of introspection, eager to rebuild not just his reputation, but the very integrity of the justice system itself. He no longer avoided the ghosts of his past mistakes. Instead, he stared them down with a newfound clarity, acknowledging the damage caused and committing himself to rectifying it, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, In the quiet, humble flat Bellamy had secured for Clara, she stood at the threshold, her heart a mix of disbelief and tentative hope. The sun streamed through the small windows, casting golden beams across the modest furnishings, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara's hands, once trembling with fear, remained steady. She breathed deeply, taking in the sight of her new surroundings, a place she could finally call her own, free from the shadows of a past that had sought to destroy her. Bellamy, his expression as calm as always, leaned against the doorframe, his briefcase resting under one arm. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken promises. "The interviews will come, but with each one you'll take back control of your story. It's the first step toward clearing your name in the eyes of the world." Clara turned to face him, her green eyes glowing with a renewed sense of purpose. "The truth will set things right," she replied, her voice steady. "If telling my story helps someone else avoid the hell I've been through, then it's worth it." Bellamy tipped his hat, a faint smile touching his lips before turning to leave. As the door clicked shut behind him, Clara walked to the window, looking down at the lively street below. Children played, couples strolled hand in hand, and the world seemed to move on, indifferent to her struggles. Yet for Clara, it felt as if everything had changed. The weight she had carried for so long had lifted, and a new life, filled with possibilities, had begun. In the courthouse, Agatha Marple finished gathering her belongings, her movements deliberate, almost meditative. Each item, the bag, the hat, the knitting needles, was handled with the same care that had guided her throughout the case. The marble floors beneath her feet seemed to echo with the reverberations of the truth that had been revealed. As she made her way toward the main entrance, the soft sound of her footsteps was the only thing breaking the silence. She paused at the threshold, her gaze drifting out toward the square. The imposing columns of the courthouse loomed behind her, but they no longer felt so cold, so distant. The weight of the case had shifted, leaving behind a feeling of quiet triumph. Justice had been served, yes, but something deeper had been restored: balance. Agatha adjusted her hat, her face calm, unreadable, and stepped into the bright sunlight, the cool air greeting her with a sharp clarity. She began her descent down the stone steps, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles, a soft accompaniment to her steps. She moved slowly, taking her time, her expression pensive but serene. The mysteries of the world, the tangled webs of corruption and deceit, had been unraveled in ways that few could have imagined. Yet, as she walked away from the courthouse, there was no need to look back. This chapter had ended, and the next one awaited, full of new challenges, new stories to uncover, and new truths to reveal. In the end, it wasn't just about finding the guilty. It was about ensuring that the balance between right and wrong could be restored, piece by delicate piece. The sun was warm on her face, the air crisp and invigorating. As she walked toward the unknown, Agatha felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she knew she was on the right one. Justice had been served, and a quiet, powerful force of redemption had begun its slow, sure march.